In this video, we're going to start working with absolute value functions. All right, so the formal definition, it's a formula, the formal definition for the absolute value is it's the distance away from zero. And there's really only one time that I'm working with absolute values that I think about it in this way. In general, the basic idea for absolute values is it just takes away the negative sign because the distance is always positive. So 5, if I have a number line, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 away from 0. Negative 5 is also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 away from 0. So it basically just takes away that negative sign and gives me the positive value. Great way to think about it. There is one time where thinking about it as the distance away from 0 is actually useful, so I just want you to be aware of that. But for the most part, taking away the negative sign is fine. All right, when we're dealing with absolute value functions, we want to evaluate and plug in stuff. We just remember the absolute values are just like parentheses. We're going to simplify inside of them as much as possible to get rid of them before we start trying to do other things in the equations. Absolute values are actually even more strict than parentheses because if I had something like this, I technically could distribute this 2 into my parentheses first and then simplify. That's not normally the way we would do it, but it's technically fine. But if I had this with the absolute values, I have to simplify inside the absolute value first before I try to do anything with multiplication. All right, so really, when you're doing order of operations, absolute value is kind of the first thing you want to do. All right, so let's look at this function. F of x equals this. I want to do f of negative 2. So remember, f of negative 2 means I'm putting in this negative 2 for the x. And we just said we want to simplify in here first. So we're going to add those. Now we just have a single number. The absolute value of a number is just the positive version. And now I can do my multiplication finally and get my final answer. All right, so just kind of a word of warning that make sure I'm plugging in my number. I simplify in here first. Now I do the absolute value of this negative number is the positive number. And look, it's the exact same thing we just got. It's negative 7. All right, so just make sure with absolute values, you don't try to multiply into the absolute value. You don't try to take the absolute value of both of these and make this 2 plus 4. All right, simplify it to a single number, then take the absolute value, and then work with everything else. All right, same thing here. We had this absolute value with an exponent on the outside. Remember, exponents happen after parentheses and groupings and all that stuff. So when I put in negative 2, I'm going to simplify inside the absolute value first. It's negative 1. Then I'm going to take the absolute value, turns it into positive 1. That squared still there. Then I do exponents before multiplication. All right, so now I square 1 to get 1, and I get negative 4. All right, so just being really careful with the order of operations. There's a bunch of different ways you can make mistakes here. You could distribute this negative 4 in, but multiplication happens after absolute values. You could square both of these, but the exponent happens after absolute values. Just make sure you're careful with those types of things. I'm going to simplify inside here first. The absolute value of 0 is 0. The distance away from 0 is 0. 0 squared is 0. Multiplied by 0 is 0. Here's some for you to try on your own. All right, some more things, but make sure you're just following the order of operations, kind of simplifying through inside things first as you go. All right, so I'll show you the answers in 3, 2, 1. And nothing too crazy happening here, but as long as you simplify the absolute value first, then you can add those numbers. And now that all was inside the square root, so the square root is actually the last thing that's going to happen, you get those final answers. So importantly, when working with absolute values, just make sure you simplify inside that absolute value first before you do anything else, and you can't distribute into an absolute value. All right, so the most common mistake people have when they're trying to work with an equation is writing this as something like this. But absolute values do this really weird thing that doesn't really happen often. It's just kind of getting rid of a negative. So you can't do stuff like this. All right, you have to leave these separate. All right, order of operations kind of forces you to do that.